Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever it is you're tuning in from. Thank you so much for joining us virtually today. I'm Hayla Alawi, and on behalf of Atmosphere Press, I am so pleased to welcome you to today's live author reading of Twisted Fiction. We'll be hearing from Nellie Hill reading from Sunday Jenks, released September 10th, Sam A.D. reading from Steps, released October 15th, and Helen Montague Foster, reading from Lost Graces, releasing on November 4th. All three authors' books can be purchased both from online retailers and from select bookstores. And of course, the books can be ordered on Atmosphere Press's website. That's at atmospherepress.com/books. I'm also going to put links to each book on the website directly in the chat for everybody. At the end of today's event, we will have time for audience questions. So during the readings, if you have a question for one or more of our authors, go ahead and type those in the chat and I'll make sure they get asked. Please do stay muted for the duration of the event, but feel free to use the chat also for any praise and comments. And one last note is that we at Atmosphere Press appreciate your support today and always. If you have a manuscript of your own, we would love to read it, so submit your work today to books@atmospherepress.com. Again, thank you so much for tuning in and supporting Nellie, Sam, and Helen today. We're going to start off with our first reader, who is Nellie Hill. Nellie grew up in the Midwest and spent many childhood summers on a lake in southern New England. When she graduated from New York University, she remained in New York to work in various aspects of publishing. After her marriage, she moved to San Francisco and soon discovered hiking in the California Sierras and the high Cascade Ranges of Washington state. Nellie has published short fiction and poems in a variety of literary journals, such as American Poetry Review, the Harvard Magazine, and the New England Review, and is the author of 5 chapbooks. As she continued to write and publish her work, she studied massage and acupressure and soon became a massage therapist. Today we'll be hearing Nellie read from Sunday Jenks, in which an aspiring young poet, Sarah, leaves her artist husband and moves to San Francisco. She meets her enchanting new boss, Al, and before long, she wonders if she and Al are a couple. But is that what Sarah really wants? She doesn't trust Al and fears she left an artist for a con artist. Now let's welcome Nellie to hear the story.
Thank you, Hayla. I'm trying to keep it within the time frame, but I thought I'd read a few of the first pages to give a sense of the two characters. Then we'll move on. It's like a few months to see what the characters are doing on a weekend. Oh, that's the wrong. Wait a second. I'm sorry. Should have opened. Okay, Sarah Demcott knocked on the orange door and cautiously entered a little hole-in-the-wall office on California Street. From the twangy Southern accent on the phone, she'd been uncertain about even going for the interview, but the hours and the pay the man had quoted were so good that she couldn't resist. He'd said, "Don't dress up or anything. This is a real informal place. Just wear your jeans or something casual like that." He was a grinning man with round blue eyes and a face shaped like a moon. His auburn hair appeared to be oiled and combed around his face like a wreath. He leaned back in his chair with his feet on the desk. He was wearing cowboy boots and rust-colored suede pants with large, suspicious-looking stains on the legs. Sarah, a slim young woman, had worn her blue and green paisley dress in spite of his advice to wear jeans, and she'd put on lipstick and pinned her blonde hair up with a ribbon in order to look older. She was almost 28, but most people guessed she was 23, the age she'd been when she'd gotten married. "Hi there," the man said. "How you doing? Come on in. Don't be shy." He waved toward the wooden chair that faced his desk. Sit down, sit down. How do you like my office?" "Not much, is it?" "This is it, though. Not much, but the rent's cheap, and that's good." Sarah looked around. It was true. The office was hardly bigger than a closet, but did that matter? There were no windows. You could hear the noise of the street traffic through the walls. Adjacent to Mr. Jackson's desk was a second desk with a typewriter. The shelves along the walls were filled with empty wine bottles, piles of paper, and stacks of brightly colored boxes. A strange odor reminded Sarah of a beauty parlor. She remembered he'd said something about hair dye on the phone. Mr. Jackson began to talk fast, explaining the business in great detail. The brightly colored packages contained wig dye, and his partner, Art Baker, drove a Volkswagen through Oregon and Washington, delivering the dye to beauty parlors. Mr. Jackson's Southern twang had a hypnotizing effect on Sarah, and sometimes, to Sarah's ears, his speech sounded like of an Irish brogue, and that, along with his fast-moving eyes, meant she was unable to keep track of what he was saying. When she mentioned that she was a poet and that's why she wanted to work part-time, he said, "Oh, that's great. I like artists. That's why I always encourage Art to keep up with his painting. I like to have all kinds of interesting people around and keep things from getting boring and shuffling papers just to be important." "That's why I moved here from New York," Sarah said. "I came out here a few months ago this past spring to try to find a way to earn a living and write at the same time." She was sorry now that she hadn't worn her jeans. She liked Mr. Jackson, even though he had something shifty about him. She found herself wanting to show him that she trusted him and that she was reliable. He handed Sarah a stack of contracts to look through, but she felt so self-conscious under his gaze she could hardly see the print. She smoothed back her hair. Little pieces of it were always falling forward, making her look like a child, much to her dismay. "Think you could type the names in here? Like that, stuff like that, and a few letters. Oh, yes, and answering the phones. That's all. Not too bad, right? Think you could work here?" "Sure," Sarah said, and the pay was good, almost too good. She didn't plan to be here forever. Best of all, there wouldn't be much pressure, and the job was mornings only, which was exactly what she wanted. His eagerness to show her much about the business made her curious, too. Was he hiding something? And yet she felt strangely defensive, as if she wanted to prove to him that she meant what she said. She wasn't lying. She did this by watching him unblinkingly, without moving a muscle in her face that might give away who she was or what she was thinking. The only thing she could be lying about was wanting a job at all. But she had to have a roof over her head and she had to eat. She didn't need much, just a little place to live and time to write. "I really would like to work for you, Mr. Jackson, but I need a night to sleep on it. I'll phone you tomorrow." When she got home, she phoned Josephine, a writer friend. Josephine said, "Of course you should take it." So moving on, I think I'm still in the time frame. So moving on, my guess is this is half a month and a half or something. Al had made reservations at a resort motel just to the north of Reno. It was a beautiful setting with a view of mountains, and it had sauna baths and a swimming pool. They sat next to the window at dinner. A broad stream flowed by just beneath the windows. One of the choices on the menu was trout, freshly caught from that stream. The next morning, Al said, "There's a riding stable just down the road. Let's go." Al rented 2 horses, old and bent nags that had been dulled and hardened from too much contact with inexperienced riders. The horses lumbered dutifully across the brown hills with Sarah and Al on their backs. Sarah sat upright, riding as she had for years, as if she were still at the farm in the Midwestern river country of fields and woods. Al's horse was the more spirited of the two, and as Al plodded ahead of Sarah, she noticed how, with his cowboy hat pulled over his eyes, he sat slumped in the saddle, hanging on to the pommel. He had no feeling for riding a horse. His back was as rounded and as soft-looking as his stomach, 2 bags of grain. He turned around and grinned back at Sarah. "I'm a cattle rustler," he said, his eyes shining. The trail climbed gradually for an hour or so, and then it leveled out onto a long, flat plateau. From time to time, the trail appeared to be lost, sometimes mixed in with other tracks, and sometimes covered in the rubble of dry gray desert shrubs. All around them were high, rounded mountains, brown and bare, like dried up prehistoric relics. The desert seemed to her like a vast and raw place where there were no memories, and no future. The air was cold and autumnal. Now they were climbing a steeper grade. The horses had picked up the speed, and Al was rocking back and forth in his saddle. Clearly, he knew nothing about riding, nothing about animals. It pained Sarah to see this, the poor horse, and she looked away. Somehow, snow lined the crevices above them, and the air up here was so cold she could see her breath and also Al's and the breath of the horses. She gently pulled in the reins and turned around to look down upon the valley below. There was the highway winding through the valley and beyond on this edge of the horizon like a wall of teeth. Long range of purple mountains rose into the ceiling of thunderclouds, as if rising into their own shadows. She looked at the highway again. From here, it appeared to be such a small strip cutting its way through this harsh land. Only 6 months ago, she'd driven by herself on that very highway on her journey from New England to San Francisco. She'd been a different person then. She'd been full of hope, looking forward to whatever she was going to find in San Francisco, and happy to leave her marriage behind. She took a deep breath. Al said, "Hey, will you look at that view? Isn't it beautiful? Did you see those clouds? Have you ever seen anything so beautiful? That sky? Look! And those mountains? Have you ever seen such beauty? Man, I love the desert. Yes, indeed, I'm a real desert man. Hey, Sarah Demcott, what do you think of this country, huh? Didn't I tell you that you'd love the desert?" And we can leave them there.
Thank you so much, Nellie. And thank you for introducing the story to us with that cliffhanger at the end. I feel like we all want to know what's happening next. So thank you so much for bringing that reading to us. Reading
Oh,
next tonight is Sam AD, or I should say this morning, where Sam is. Samantha has spent over 25 years reading other people's stories and helping them come to life through her film and television career. Now she has her own story to tell in this debut, Steps. Sam AD is based in Melbourne, Australia. In Steps, to curb an overpopulated world, governments have imposed a lifespan limit of 60 million steps, after which individuals face instant, painless death. As citizens strive to extend their lives, they reinvent personal mobility, leading to clashes of subcultures and chaos as a city teeters on the brink of collapse during its busiest night of the year. As society's fabric is tested, Steps poses the question, what would you do? Sam, take it away.
Thanks, Hayla. Well, I want to read a couple of paragraphs from three type of different sections of my book. One will be covering a character, and then I'll move into a location, and then I'll move on to a subculture, just so you can get a bit of an idea of where I'm going with this book. So my first character is Agnes. She's the first one I came up with, so I'll just read a few paragraphs from her. Traversing across the park was usually a relatively easy task, sometimes even fun. Agnes enjoyed the challenge it presented. Usually she would roll like a log down a hill, except there was no hill. She was always self-propelled, but she could get to the other side, no problem. Her abs hard like giant overcooked nuggets from a lifetime of rolling. The trade-off was her body, constantly scratched and covered in scratches and bruises. Usually nothing to worry about, just little nicks here and there. She would laugh at herself afterwards. Looking in the mirror, a scarecrow often returned her gaze. Sticks, leaves trapped in her hair and clothes. A natural ghillie suit. Therefore, she always smelled like grass and soil, earthy. She had become quite advanced in the art of rolling, but some unplanned, unpleasant things still happened, like the time she rolled over a poo mound or two. Some things are just unavoidable when you travel at ground level. It's a small price to pay. Agnes is 24 years old. She's 147 centimetres and 55 kilos, and she's chosen to be a roller as her way to get around. But today is different. It had been atrocious weather last week. Persistent rain, hail, thunder, and gale force winds reduced the usually even rolling parkland into a minefield of mud, potholes, fallen branches, and debris. Surveying the area, she realised she had no chance of rolling the entire way today. She checked her SLT strapped to her wrist. 31,011,241 steps left. She's done well throughout her life, conserving her steps. Rolling worked well for her. She can do it, she will just have to walk. She doesn't want to. No one really does it anymore, not in the traditional sense. Mostly crazy people and a few adventurous folk who refuse to be governed by the STEPS program. However, a lifetime of rolling has left her legs in quite a state. Unlike her abs, she barely has any muscle mass in her legs. They just kind of dangle around. But today she will need them, and the park is quite big. She hopes they have the strength to carry her through with a minimum fuss. Another problem is her legs are quite short, and it would take her twice as many steps as anybody else. She loathed the short-legged burden she was born with. Now Agnes finds herself surveying the park, swimming goggles in hand. Unseen inside her head, her brain is firing on all cylinders as she tries to navigate the easiest route. She cannot see anyone else around. People don't while away their day having delightful walks through the park anymore. A large percentage of the population won't even help others anymore, not if it means using their steps, therefore decreasing their own lifespan. To be honest, it's become rather unfriendly. Social norms are now skewed. Agnes has given herself more time to get to the stadium than she thinks because there's always some kind of challenge she isn't expecting, a curveball from life, because being short with even shorter legs is clearly not punishment enough. So that was Agnes. So in a world made up of steps, obviously having short legs is not ideal. So she's decided to roll around instead as a mode of transport. And now we're going to go to a location which is called Forever 27. Forever 27 is a nightclub in my alternate reality. Legs twitching, Elio wrestles with his restless leg syndrome as he walks down the street. Time for a dance, hey? He's looking at his legs, talking to them. Of course, there's going to be a big free dance tonight, but Elio needs some movement soon. His legs fight against his calm demeanour. He decides to go to the one place where people never judge you or think you're crazy if you dance excessively. A place he really likes, despite everyone around him dying when he's there. A place he's been admiring someone for a while. He hopes she hasn't expired yet. Forever 27. Forever 27 is open every day and night from 2 p.m. till 8 a.m. It's the most notorious day nightclub in Sunshine City. The club is also known as Suicide City or 27 to Heaven. It's where all the cool kids go, people with more liberal views on life and death. People who choose not to get older and more worrisome, forever fearful about their upcoming last step. Where would they be when it happened? That's what most worried about. No one wanted to be caught out accidentally dying on the street. Everyone wanted to die in the comfort of their own home with their loved ones. If you died on the street, the council workers were most uncouth when they came to carbonise you. You were treated like a piece of street garbage, such was the value of one's life. And they were quick to come. Having corpses casually lying on the footpath wasn't a good look in a community health hazard. So Forever 27 is a place where some plan to die. Apparently, it's the best age to die. You're remembered in your prime. People come here to literally dance till they dropped. Attendees die in a rapture of music and lights, enjoying it down to the last second. Then bang, they're expired, just like that. No pain, no worries, just having a blast. The SLT devices automatically send a GPS signal to the cleaners as soon as the steps are empty. No one likes a corpse. The nightclub had to close for a 6-hour window every day to carbonise the remaining corpses and sweep them up, refresh the bar and mop the floors. Some nights were busier than others. Sundays were the busiest. No one likes Mondays. And so now I'm going to go to a subculture, which is probably my favourite subculture in the book. And all these subcultures are formed when people try to develop new ways to get around that is not walking. So this subculture is called the ballers. Here they come, bouncing downhill out of control, taking out random people here and there, bouncing inside their big, clear, sweaty plastic balls. One goes straight into a stilt walker and sends him toppling over like bowling pins, eating the cement footpath with his head and shoulders. Blood explodes from his head as he starts to wail in pain. One of his legs is bent at an unnatural angle. The ballers don't care. They can't just stop. They just keep on balling. That's one major drawback to choosing to be a baller. You just can't just stop. Coming down the hill, they're unstoppable and unsteerable. Kind of like running with bulls, just as dangerous. Sure, there was a potential to cover large amounts of ground if you did it right, but there were just too many things that could go wrong, and they were too unpredictable. Not only did ballers injure and sometimes kill other people, They quite often injured themselves, sometimes resulting in their own death. One was found dead in their ball, floating 7 kilometres off the coast just last month. It wasn't good. After floating around in their plastic clear coffin with the sun beating down on them relentlessly for weeks, they were slowly poached, sous vide, I think they call it. They had to pull the liquidized body out. Axel didn't think it was a wise choice as a mode of transport, which made sense because only the idiots and riffraff seemed to pick balling as a way to get around. Flop, flop, flop. Incoming idiots, brace yourself. Axel gives Agnes a heads up. The first 3 ballers flop on by without incident. The 4th and 5th are going in the right direction, clear of innocent bystanders, but the 2 people inside have lost control. They've lost their footing and are being thrown around wildly like a human washing machine. They're squealing. It looks like it's been going on for a while. They barely have any fight left in them, just letting the ball toss them around like rag dolls. The 6th one, the one who hit the stilt walker earlier, seems to know exactly what he's doing. He has full control of the ball, and it makes one wonder if he hit the stilt walker for sport, probably. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha, and thank you for kind of painting the picture of the world. I think that's the most, maybe not the most fascinating thing, but I always think that's a very exciting aspect of any kind of setting like this. So it was great to be able to bring that to life and to see it come together with the characters. Our final reader for today is Helen Montague Foster. Helen is a poet, novelist, and retired physician, deeply influenced by her many years as a psychiatrist and psychotherapist for people with lives affected by trauma. An early version of her debut novel, The Silent Hen, placed second in the 2020 William Faulkner Literary Competition under the title Crossing the Same Sea. She and her husband live in Virginia and spend much of their time canoeing, hiking, and vicariously enjoying the adventures of their children and grandchildren. Today, we'll be hearing Helen read from Lost Graces, in which, after someone shoots a colleague, psychiatrist Dr. Nancy Thomas learns disturbing secrets that force her to rethink her approach as a therapist. With her husband away, her children grown and gone, colleagues dying, and her anxiety surging, she fears she may become prey to a serial killer. We'll hear more of the story now from Helen herself.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Hala. I'm going to start with the first chapter and read a bit of the opening, and then I will jump to the 5th chapter to introduce the titular character, Grace. Back in mid-1990s, when we lived south of the James, my commute to work led me over the Huguenot Bridge, where rising mist often interrupted my busy mind with spooky atmosphere. The morning it all started, geese appeared from fog worthy of Edgar Allan Poe and flew out of sight while I inched into nothingness. There was no sound from the ghost darting in front of my car. I stomped my brakes, and the next thing I knew, he'd mounted the rail and raised his arms, and I'd yelled and punched my hazard button. An image of his face, transforming with each pulse, still appears in my mind's eye from time to time, filed away beside a childhood nightmare in which everything became intolerably white. The man on the bridge was no dream figure, though, and before my window was halfway down, he swung himself like a gymnast vaulting off a pommel horse, thumped back onto the bridge and ran. It wasn't so much that I believed he was about to jump. After all this time, I'm still not sure, but I couldn't rule it out and took the chance of leaving my car. There was a great deal of honking after that. A car drove around mine, a dangerous situation given that there were just 2 lanes and visibility was close to zero. And the man's resemblance to my new patient was both strong enough and obscured enough that I was left alarmed and doubting. In those days, our practice owned a briefcase-sized car phone, And my partner, Susan, the on-call person for the weekend, had it, so there was nothing I could do. Even if I'd been able to call crisis intervention, all they could do was take a report. MIST sounded like MISSED, I thought, while fog rose in small teardrops from the river, an image born of ambivalence. In this case, toward the new patient, I'd come close to transferring to someone else for therapy, something my conscience wouldn't permit. Somebody behind me leaned on the horn, making me cringe. By that time, I'd returned to my car and taillights reappeared ahead. There was no option but to stop. The longer traffic idled in place, the more I worried that someone had jumped. I fantasized pulling over at the eye hospital at the far end of the bridge and hiking back across the floodplain to find him. Though for what? I'd have to swim the canal and hike through the tall grass to get down to the river. Richmond was built on the falls of the James. Even where the river looked calm, it flowed relentlessly. If Alan had jumped, his body would already have floated downstream of the eye hospital. A car ahead of me honked twice, but traffic still didn't move. If there were room for a U-turn, I might have driven back south to Huguenot Woods, where Mac and I sometimes canoed. There were places to park near the water, but I wouldn't find a jumper unless he made it back to shore. More realistically, turning back would have made me late for work. Eventually, my lane crept to life, and I switched on the radio. The roadway curved over the floodplain. The fog thinned and sunlight streamed in rays that changed my view from a total void to black and white, Ansel Adams, and then to the modern guy, Thomas Kincaid, painter of light, with his gilded clouds and sunbursts. Huguenot Road, River Road, and Carey Street met at the traffic signals at the corner of the Country Club of Virginia, where most commuters from the West End and South Side took polite turns merging. I assessed faces in other cars. Meanwhile, listening to Morning Edition, which paused for breaking news about a doctor shot somewhere near a bakery. As a medical student, I'd witnessed a guard shoot a prisoner after he took an intern hostage, an incident that left me permanently vigilant. The intern had thrown himself to safety while blood gurgled out the prisoner's mouth like water from a drinking fountain, requiring intravenous lines in every accessible site to keep him alive. My job had been to jab a needle into his groin to draw blood from his femoral vein. Probably a procedure a private patient wouldn't want inflicted by a medical student on her way to a career in psychiatry. My new patient, Alan, had consistently denied suicidal thoughts, but something about his manner kept me from entirely believing him. At that point, he hadn't been aggressive with me, except for a fleeting sneer when he told me about flash daydreams of shooting a coworker. His employee assistance counselor said she'd never evaluated anyone more hostile. Still, I had no valid reason to believe he had anything to do with the shooting mentioned on the radio or that he was the phantom on the bridge. In my mind's eye, his face was vivid, full, perfectly shaped lips, big eyes rimmed with lashes black as mascara, strong jaw and dimpled chin, a face that inspired double takes and might be easy to mentally superimpose on a fog-dim figure. The person on the bridge had, at the least, resembled him. Now I am going to switch ahead to chapter 5 so you can meet Grace. And I am starting halfway down chapter 5. But it was time for me to see Grace. And when I opened the waiting room door, she gave me a spooked squint through her blonde bangs and took off toward my office, giving me an unfortunate view of a bikini panty outline through too tight slacks. She plopped onto my sofa and tugged her t-shirt over her knees. I hoped she'd focus a little more than usual, but no, she looked at the ceiling. She stared at her feet. She pouted as if thinking of something irritating, changing so often that I felt as if I were sharing the room with quarreling children. After a while, she smiled and rested her slender arm across the back of the sofa. "Dr. Thomas," she said, using her meek voice. She held her forefinger in her opposing fist. "I'm confused. The voices don't want me to talk to you." The first few times I saw her, she denied hearing voices, but it hadn't taken long for her to admit she did hear them, and she seemed so suggestible that I wondered if she'd made them up to entertain me, which actually did, given that my own nest was empty. Eventually, she had volunteered that she could slide through the floor, right through the wood, into a space underneath. Sometimes she'd roll back her eyes and sink into her seat, maybe give a little wriggle, and her face would empty. If I asked what was happening at such times, she stayed blank and said nothing was bothering her. Sometimes she glared at me as if I were the cause of the world's misery. At other times, she acted like a baby who loved only me, and every bit of it felt sincere. I prescribed an antipsychotic as much for her rage episodes as for the voices, but was proceeding under the assumption that she suffered from dissociative identity disorder or something close to it. It amazed me that so many of my colleagues didn't believe in the diagnosis. It made some of them angry, as if the claim were the existence of actual separate selves in the same body rather than trauma-induced self-hypnosis. Whatever we called it, DID for dissociative identity disorder or MPD for multiple personality disorder, I saw the problem as dissociative spaciness and excess pretending rather than actual inhabitation by separate selves. Not that anyone was entirely single-minded. At that point, the diagnosis required 2 or more distinct personality states. Not much about Grace was distinct, though, and that morning she looked as if something had frightened her into hiding in her mental basement. Now, I am not sure where I had planned to stop here, so I don't know. Where am I on time, Ayla?
You've got 5 minutes still, so if you'd like to keep going, please feel free.
I will. Auditory hallucinations from DID weren't easy to distinguish from those caused by psychosis. Both originated in the brain of the sufferer, but could be perceived as external sounds. Both were affected by what was going on with people who heard them, who might or might not honestly share what they were experiencing. If Grace were psychotic, I should have been increasing the medication I prescribed for her rage attacks. Unfortunately, she gained a pound a month taking it, and I wouldn't have blamed her for refusing. Maybe she wasn't taking it, but she'd said it made her feel better, and the drug rep claimed it was no worse for weight gain than any other antipsychotic, a claim that proved to be false. I sat quietly while Grace's expression flitted from blank to waif-like, her eyes an intense blue like a mosaic of crushed sea glass. Her pupils were tiny, which could have been caused by pain medication, by some neurological process, or by the bright light in my office, or maybe by her anger. My job was to read my own reactions for clues to what was going on with her, and I felt more concern than impatience. She was like a needy toddler. "Is there something I can do to make this easier, Grace?" She shook her head. "Have voices been talking to you again?" She held her finger to her lips to hush me, and I waited. "Are they talking now?" I eventually asked. Grace nodded, sucking her finger. "Tell me what they're saying." She shook her head no. "You don't have to," I said, trying to stay on her side. We sat in silence, Grace still sucking her finger and emitting something that made me feel as if I were rocking a baby. Did you see the paper? I thought of asking. But if she didn't know about the shooting, I would have to say why I wanted to know, and that might have gotten her off track. The mirror thing went two ways. She could induce feelings in me, and I could induce them in her. Are you taking your medicine? I finally asked. Yes, that was good. Maybe she would answer a question about the dissociation. What do you call yourself when you feel this way? Yiddle. She sounded like a 3-year-old. Little? She nodded. Yiddle Grace. Her pupils dilated, a clue that it wasn't pain medication or some brain injury that made them small. For a while, she didn't speak or move. Then she leaned forward, looping hair behind her ear as if there'd been no lapse. Dr. Thomas, I feel so weird. How? People are messing with me. Tell me. Screw you. You just want to nail me. Nails reminded me of screws and of flat tires, and I will interrupt myself here to mention that before each of the shootings, there's been a flat tire. And given her suggestibility, the best I could do was nudge her along using her own words as prompts, but she didn't answer when I asked if she wanted someone to nail her. Is there something you don't want me to know? I ventured. No answer. You seem like you're trying to protect yourself. As my voice softened, a distinct tear slid down Grace's face. She nodded and gave me a worshipful look. My grandfather said he would kill myself if I didn't do what he wanted. Did you want him to kill himself? She shook her head. I tried to throw his gun in the water. What gun? I don't know. I asked again about her hearing voices, but she denied it. Apparently unaware, she told me the opposite in the same hour. I closed her chart and prepared to stand. Her head hurt, she said. I don't see how our session can be over. I just got here. Why don't I remember what happened? Do you remember anything we talked about? I asked. No, she shook her head sadly, and I'm tired. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you for diving into almost like that character study and giving us that perspective. I think it's an unusual one, but one that's very interesting, of course, to readers. So at this time, we do have time for our audience Q&A. So if you have a question for one or more of our authors, please go ahead and type those in the chat and I'll make sure they get asked. We do already have a question. This is for all three authors. The question is, did you have a specific inspiration for your story? If so, what was it and how did it impact your book? If not, how did the idea come to you? I'm thinking we could go in reading order. So Nellie, do you want to start us off with this one?
I started writing this novel a long time ago, which means I can't quite remember. The characters were in my head and the questions they presented. So I just wanted to make these different scenes, and it kept going and re-going.
Yeah, sometimes once the ball is rolling, it just keeps rolling, right?
Yeah.
Sam, what about you? What was your specific inspiration for this story?
Well, my story's actually been hitchhiking inside of me since I was very young, maybe around 11 years old. It was from a childhood fear, like, step on a crack and you'll fall in, that sort of thing. But my childhood fear was actually running out of steps. I ridiculously did think that we only had so many steps within our body, and that once all of those steps were gone, we just wouldn't have any more in us anymore. And future me always worried about being stuck in a scenario where I'd wasted my steps for my life, but I'm at a point in my life where I really need them to get somewhere or to save my life. But and then I'd think about how frivolous I'd been, like just stepping here and there willy-nilly in my youth. So yeah, I guess it's kind of always been with me. So the story, was more, the concept has been with me, but was more coming up with the story and a plot line and why are people doing this and what's behind it all. So that's where mine came from.
Yeah, I think that idea of stemming from a childhood fear or at least a childhood fixation informs a lot of authors' work. So I'm sort of not surprised to hear that, and I think that's a really interesting thread to develop on. So also I want to get to Helen. What were your inspirations for this story?
Well, first, could I say that Sam's inspiration was really interesting and surprised me because I was thinking about steps being such a current thing, the counting of steps. That must have been interesting to have that appear a little bit later on in your life where people were so interested in getting in their steps. But back to my book, I was inspired by my wrangling with managed care companies about permission to treat my patients at a time when the Southside Strangler was prowling about in Richmond. And so someone I knew was killed by him, and many professional women were frightened um, that they might be the next target. Um, so I started writing during that time, and I wrote a bit more when we had another serial killer or pair of serial killers, the Beltway bandits who were shooting people from the backs of their cars. So I was kind of inspired by those things in the setting of managed care. It was interesting to me how people would lose perspective, but it was doubly scary when they were, I had been working in, at crisis intervention where we would go and evaluate people who were suicidal or homicidal. And occasionally, you would evaluate someone and you would ask them, if they were thinking of killing themselves, and they'd say yes. And you would say, well, have you ever killed anyone before? And they would say yes. And so you would think, well, I think it'd probably be a good idea for you to go to the hospital right away. So scary things happened then. And those are things that inspired my story. I probably didn't say that very well, but in the context of having insurance companies saying, no, you cannot see that person another time, you can't see them, but half an hour once a month, that was frightening.
Yeah, I remember when I found out how much of this was drawn from real life. That was a horrifying revelation, and it's kind of really um, brings to the forefront how prevalent this of an issue this really is for so many people. Hopefully not to this degree, of course, but that kind of idea. We have another question. This one is for Sam from Sharon. Great storyline, great characters. Will there be a follow-up book?
Possibly. I did close a lot of the story at the end of the book, but I also opened up some new threads specifically to carry into a second book. So I do have half an idea for a second book. We'll wait and see how this one goes.
Yeah, I'm also excited to see what develops with sequels or potentially a series kind of thing, especially again with this genre. So we'll have to keep our eyes peeled for that. Um, Next question we've got in, this one is for Helen. How much research did you do to differentiate or it says differentiate your characters from real life inspiration, or was it purely based off of existing characters?
Well, I had to work really hard to make sure that I wasn't basing it on anyone real, because I really don't have, I have to keep confidentiality. So I had to be very careful. In fact, there was a situation that happened that was at the time that I was inspired by these events, when I had to appeal the case of a patient for something like 6 months to keep getting permission to treat a person. And that person, I had to disguise very carefully when I presented the case to a group of colleagues so that no one could identify him. Um, so I was really careful while writing this book not to base any patient on anyone that I really knew. I chose superficial descriptions about things that my husband and I might do, just as background. But the patients, the real people who mattered in the story, I was very careful to make them not so much composites as to choose behaviors that lots of people have, lots of patients had. If I hadn't had 5 or 6 people like that, I probably wouldn't have put a particular detail in. If I just had one patient who dissociated, for instance, I wouldn't have really been able to write about that. But I had lots of patients who did that.
Yeah, I've always kind of been curious about how that plays out because I know that there are a lot of authors who come from a similar background where they're obviously limited by that confidentiality. Um, so it's interesting to see, almost like the mental gymnastics you have to go through just to make sure that everything is kind of covered in that way. But clearly it's kind of working out as we've seen. This next question we have is for Nellie. As a prolifically published writer based on your author bio, do you have a favorite genre or format to write in?
To write in a mode, you mean, in which I write? No, it just comes the way it comes. I can't pick and choose.
Mm, yeah, it just whatever speaks to you comes out on the page, it sounds like.
Yes, and I can't even tell myself you must write this. One of my friends said, "Oh, you've got to write a poem about that. My catching a catfish with my bare hands." I said I can't even tell myself to write a poem about anything. So the answer is no. I'm in limbo. Me,
Yeah, I
myself, and
know
I.
I know a lot of writers can resonate with that, so it's always interesting to hear the perspectives on that. Okay, so at this point, I just want to say that it was so great to hear all of your books come to life. And so thank you so much to Nellie, Sam, and Helen for just coming together and being generous with us with your words and your thoughts in the Q&A. Thank you to everyone in the audience for being here with us to help celebrate these authors as well. I'm going to put the links to all 3 of the books in the chat one more time, so don't forget to place your orders for those. And please also consider checking out atmospherepress.com to browse our new and forthcoming releases, sign up for our email newsletter, or submit a book manuscript of your own. You can submit your work to books@atmospherepress.com and just let us know that you attended today's event. We'll look forward to hearing from you, but until then, that's it for tonight. So have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you, Hala.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Yes,
everybody.
thank you. You're a wonderful. Forgot the word you used.
Host.
Um, could be publicist or events manager. But
Events
thank you so
manager.
much.
Well, but pulling the group together, I think,
Oh, thank you so much.
keeping it
All
there.
right. Have a good night or day, everybody.
Thanks to
Thank
you.
you. Good